You're fired. Get your stuff and get out of my garage. Those 6 words. That's all it took to destroy everything Ryan Carter had left. Just saved a man's life. 12 minutes of CPR on a concrete floor, sweat burning his eyes, knuckles cracked and bleeding. This was his reward. But here's the thing. Nobody tells you about doing the right thing when you have nothing. Sometimes it costs you everything first. And sometimes it brings back something you never even knew you'd lost. This story moves you. Subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Ryan Carter had a system. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't noble. It was just survival stripped down to its bones, the way survival always is when you've been doing it alone since you were 15 years old. Wake up before 6. Splash cold water on your face in a bathroom the size of a closet. Don't look at yourself in the mirror too long. Eat whatever's cheap and close, usually a gas station breakfast sandwich or a pack of crackers that cost $1.29. Walk the 3 blocks to the garage. Clock in before 7. Work until your hands stop hurting, which, if you were being honest, they never really did anymore. Clock out, come back to the room, lock the door, sleep, repeat. That was the system. And for 2 years, it had kept Ryan Carter alive. Not comfortable, not happy, not anything close to what most 20-year-olds would call a life, but alive. And in Phoenix, Arizona, in the kind of heat that made the air shimmer off the asphalt like something angry was boiling underneath the city, alive was enough. Alive was the goal. Alive was what you celebrated on the days you had nothing else to celebrate. Ryan had aged out of the foster care system at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes, a state-issued bus pass that expired in 30 days, and a pamphlet about resources for transitional youth that assumed he had a phone to call them on and an address to receive mail. He had neither. What he had was a mechanical instinct that had been sharpened since he was 12 years old, tinkering with a busted dirt bike behind a group home in Tempe, figuring out by pure trial and error how engines work. Engines, he'd learned early on, were honest. They didn't pretend. They didn't smile at you and then move you to a new placement 3 weeks later. They didn't tell you they cared and then forget your birthday 4 years in a row. Engines had rules. You learned the rules, you respected the rules, you got results. There was a clarity to mechanical work that Ryan had never found anywhere else in his life. Victor Hale had spotted that clarity about 4 seconds after Ryan walked through the door of Desert Road Garage 2 years ago. Sunburned and broke, and trying very hard to look like neither. "You know bikes?" Victor had said, eyeing the 17-year-old in front of him with the assessment of a man who had spent 30 years calculating exactly how much he could get out of people. "Yes, sir," Ryan had said. "You got ID?" "Yes, sir." "You got a place to stay?" Ryan had hesitated just a half second too long. Victor Hale saw it. And that half second, that tiny involuntary crack in his composure, was the moment Victor Hale decided Ryan Carter was exactly the kind of person he was looking for. "There's a room out back," Victor had said. "Basic. Nothing fancy. You work for me. You stay in the room." Deal? It wasn't a deal. Ryan knew that even then. Deal implied 2 equal parties negotiating. What Victor was offering was a leash dressed up as an opportunity. The room came with the job, which meant the job controlled the room, which meant Victor controlled everything. Your employer and your landlord and your lifeline all wrapped up in one man who smiled like he was doing you a favor. But Ryan was 17 and exhausted, and the alternative was the street. So he said yes. And for 2 years he told himself it was temporary. That was the other part of the system. The mental part. The part that didn't show up in the daily routine, but ran underneath it, quietly, like a pilot light keeping something alive in the dark. Temporary. This is temporary. Save enough for a deposit and first and last month's rent. Do the math every night. Figure out how many more weeks. Keep the goal in front of you like a point on a horizon. $240 in a sock under his mattress. That was Ryan Carter's entire net worth on the morning of June 14th. $240 and a backpack and a mechanical gift that Victor Hale paid him, just enough to keep him from leaving and not nearly enough to let him go. The garage opened at 7, and by 7:15 there were already 3 bikes in the bay, a Yamaha R6 with a leaky fork seal, a beat-up Honda Shadow that needed its carburetor rebuilt, Kawasaki Ninja that belonged to a college kid who had no business riding a sport bike, but whose parents had money and a limited understanding of consequences. Ryan worked with the efficiency of someone who had learned to focus, not because it was easy, but because focus was the only thing standing between him and the weight of everything else. Didn't talk much. That was by design. At Desert Road Garage, conversations had a way of turning into information that Victor could use. Ryan had learned this slowly, the way you learn most painful lessons, by making the mistake first and understanding it afterward. There had been a guy named Deacon, a few months after Ryan started. Older, funnier, easier in his skin. Deacon had talked freely about his situation, that he was saving up to get his kid's sister out of a bad living arrangement, that he needed this job, that he couldn't afford to lose it. Victor had filed every word away like ammunition. Deacon asked for a raise 6 months later. Victor had smiled and said, "Where else are you going to go, Deacon? Who else is going to hire someone with your record?" He hadn't said it cruelly, said it the way you state a fact. Like gravity, like weather, Deacon had stayed and Ryan had learned. Don't give Victor anything he can use. So Ryan kept his head down and his hands moving and said as little as possible and did his work so well that Victor couldn't fire him without losing a genuine asset, which was the only kind of job security Ryan trusted. It was around 11 that morning when the sound came. Ryan was elbow deep in the Kawasaki's engine, running a torque wrench along a stubborn bolt when he heard it. Most people would have heard it as just traffic, the particular rumble of a motorcycle engine on the street outside. Ryan's ears were tuned differently. He heard the particular rumble of that engine, the low, authoritative growl of an American V-twin with serious displacement, the kind of engine that didn't apologize for the space it took up. Straightened up, through the open bay door, he watched a motorcycle roll to a stop in front of the garage. It was a Harley-Davidson Road King, the kind of bike that told you immediately everything about its rider, that this person had been riding for a long time, that they took their maintenance seriously, that they had opinions about chrome and leather, and the difference between a motorcycle that was built for show and one that was built for miles. It was clean without being precious, lived in without being neglected. The man who climbed off it was enormous, not just tall enormous, the kind of physical presence that rearranges the space around it. He had to be 6'3" at minimum, with shoulders that belonged on someone who had spent decades doing heavy physical work, and a beard going silver gray that caught the light. He wore a leather vest over a black t-shirt, and Ryan didn't need to read the patches to understand what they meant. He'd been in Phoenix long enough to know what that vest meant, what those colors meant, what the combination of a man like this and a bike like that arriving at your garage meant. Hell's Angels. Not a prospect, not a hang-around. This man was the real thing. The age in his eyes, the ease in his posture. This was someone who had been inside the club for decades, someone who had earned every inch of what he wore. Victor materialized from the back office immediately. Ryan noticed this because Victor never materialized quickly for anything that didn't involve money or control. He had a smile on that Ryan had rarely seen him deploy wider than usual, deferential, in a way that Victor almost never was with anyone. "Cole Dawson," Victor said, extending a hand. "Good to have you here. What can we do for you?" The big man's handshake was brief and firm. "Break job," he said. His voice was the same register as the motorcycle, low, unhurried, impossible to ignore. "Front and rear. And I want whoever actually knows what they're doing working on her. Not whoever you got sweeping floors this week." Victor laughed in the particular way people laugh when they're not sure if they're being tested. "Absolutely. I'll put my best man on it." He turned and looked directly at Ryan. Ryan had already been watching. He looked away quickly, but not quickly enough. "Carter," Victor said. "Cole Dawson's Road King. Brake inspection and replacement. Full service." Ryan wiped his hands on a shop rag and walked over. He didn't say much to the customer, he rarely did. Crouched down beside the motorcycle and ran his eyes along the front brake lines, the caliper, the rotor, reading the bike the way other people might read a page of text, taking in information, processing it, forming an assessment. The rear brake setup was older, the pads worn closer than they should have been. Whoever had been servicing this bike had been cutting it close. "These rear pads are pretty far gone," Ryan said without looking up. "Front's okay for now, but I'd replace them anyway while it's in." Caliper on the rear is also showing some corrosion on the slide pins, probably causing some uneven wear. You been noticing any pulsing when you brake? Pause. Little bit, Cole Dawson said. How'd you feel that just looking at it? Seen the pattern before, Ryan said. He stood up and finally looked at the man directly. I can have it done in a few hours. I'll clean the caliper properly, new pads front and rear, bleed the lines while I'm in there. You'll feel the difference. Cole Dawson looked at him for a moment with eyes that had seen a very long time worth of people and apparently had gotten good at sorting them. How old are you, he said. It wasn't condescending. It was just a question. 20, Ryan said. Cole nodded. All right, he said, go ahead. He didn't leave. That was the first thing Ryan noticed. Most customers dropped the bike and disappeared. Cole Dawson sat down on a stool near the bay entrance and stayed, not hovering, not interfering, just present. Watching Ryan work with the same unhurried attention he seemed to apply to everything. Ryan was used to being watched. Victor watched him constantly, in the particular vigilant way of someone cataloging debts. This was different. Cole wasn't cataloging anything. He was just observing. And something about it was neither uncomfortable nor strange. It was almost like being watched the way a craftsman watches another craftsman, with recognition. They didn't talk much for the first hour. Ryan worked. Cole sat. The other mechanics moved around the bay doing their own jobs, louder and less focused than Ryan, the way people tend to be when nobody's really holding them to account. Victor checked in twice, smiling his wide smile at Cole and barely glancing at Ryan before retreating back to his office. You teach yourself? Cole said, eventually. Not an interruption. More like a thought he'd been sitting with until it was ready. Ryan set down the caliper mostly, picked things up along the way. Where'd you grow up? Ryan was quiet for a moment, picked the caliper back up, and went back to work. Here and there, he said. Around Phoenix mostly. Cole seemed to understand that this answer was an answer. Keeping you at a place like this, Cole said. And the question was casual enough on the surface, but there was something underneath it that Ryan felt but couldn't quite name. Kid with your eye could be working somewhere a lot better than Victor Hale's operation. Ryan almost smiled, almost. Working on it, he said. That was the conversation. Not dramatic, not revelatory. Just two people talking in the way people talk in garages sparsely, with space between the words. But Ryan thought about it later, turning it over in his mind, trying to understand why it had felt different from most conversations he had. Decided it was because Cole Dawson had spoken to him without any transaction behind the words. No angle, no leverage. Just a person talking to another person, which, in Ryan's experience, was rarer than it should have been. It was around 2 in the afternoon when things changed. Ryan had the rear brake caliper cleaned, the new pads seated, and was working through bleeding the brake lines, a methodical process, slow and careful, the kind of work that required patience and precision. He was crouched by the rear wheel, focused, one hand on the bleeder valve, when he heard a sound that was immediately, instinctively wrong. Not a mechanical sound, a human sound, heavy, sudden. Something falling that shouldn't be falling. He turned around. Cole Dawson was on the floor, not sitting, not leaning. The floor down on one side, his big body completely inert. The stool he'd been sitting on knocked sideways 3 feet away. A coffee cup shattered on the concrete beside him, the contents spreading in a dark stain toward Ryan's knees. For exactly 1 second, Ryan's brain refused to process it. The image didn't make sense. A man that size didn't just fall. Not like that. Not that silently, that completely. Then his brain caught up. He was across the garage floor in 5 steps. Hey, Ryan said, dropping to his knees beside Cole. Cole, can you hear me? Nothing. The man's face was slack. His color was wrong gray beneath the weathered tan, the particular gray that Ryan had never seen before but recognized immediately as something being terribly, urgently wrong. Ryan pressed 2 fingers to Cole's neck. No pulse. The thought arrived not with panic, but with a kind of terrible clarifying certainty, cardiac arrest. Someone call 911, Ryan shouted. He didn't wait to see who was going to do it. He was already positioning his hand's heel of the right palm to the center of Cole's chest, left hand on top, fingers interlaced, arms straight. Hey, what's going on over there? That was Delaney, the other mechanic, 20 feet away by the lift. Cardiac arrest. Call 911 now, Ryan said. He began compressions. Hard, fast, the way he'd been taught in a first aid class at a group home 7 years ago, that he'd never expected to need and had somehow never forgotten. The instructions came back with the clarity of something essential. 120 compressions per minute. Full chest compression, 2 inches deep. Let the chest recoil completely between compressions. Don't stop. He counted in his head. He breathed through his nose. He focused. That's when Victor appeared. Ryan heard the footsteps first, then the voice sharp, cutting, disbelieving. Carter, what are you doing? He went into cardiac arrest, Ryan said without stopping. 911's been called? Delaney, tell me someone called. I'm calling. Delaney's voice from the corner. Carter Victor's voice dropped. Get up. Ryan kept going. Carter. The voice had an edge now, the particular edge Victor used when he wanted to remind you of the power structure without saying it explicitly. I said, get up. We have protocols for this. There are people trained. There's nobody else here trained for this, Ryan said. He was breathing harder now. The physical work of proper CPR more demanding than people who'd never done it understood. And he doesn't have time to wait. Back up and let me work. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Ryan had ever heard. You work for me, Victor said. His voice had gone very quiet, which Ryan had learned over 2 years was worse than loud. Quiet was the voice Victor used when he was moving from a warning to a consequence. I am telling you to step back. Right now, this is a liability issue. Something happens to him while you're... Something is already happening to him, Ryan said. Did not stop. He did not look up. Kept his hands exactly where they were and kept his rhythm and kept his count and refused, with every fiber of something in his chest that was larger and more fundamental than fear, to let his hands stop moving. Victor said his name one more time. Ryan heard it. He registered it the way you register thunder when you're already in the rain present real and beside the point. Because in front of him, on the concrete floor, an old biker with silver in his beard and 30 years of road in his bones was dying. Ryan Carter, who had spent his entire life being told he wasn't enough, that he didn't matter, that he was someone the world could afford to forget. Ryan Carter was the only thing standing between that man and death. So he kept going. 30 compressions, check. No breath. Continue. 30 compressions, check, continue. He lost track of time. That was something they didn't tell you about CPR, how time collapsed inside it, how the world shrank to the size of the space between your hands and another person's chest. There was no garage anymore, no Victor, no room behind a motel, no sock under a mattress with $240, no system, no horizon with an apartment on it. There was just this, the count, the compression, the terrible responsibility of being the only thing keeping someone's blood moving. Delaney said something from across the garage. Ryan didn't hear the words. Victor said something else. Ryan heard the tone fury building towards something and let it pass through him like a wind. A customer appeared in the bay entrance, stopped, stood watching in the paralyzed way of someone who doesn't know what they're witnessing. Ryan blocked them all out. He was on a concrete floor in Phoenix, Arizona, and a man's heart had stopped. And Ryan Carter had decided, not with drama, not with rhetoric, just with the quiet, absolute conviction of someone who had already lost everything once and knew what it felt like, that he was not going to let this be the moment when he looked away. When the paramedics arrived, they had to say his name twice before he registered it. Sir, we've got him. You can stop. Ryan's hands stopped. His arms shook. He sat back on his heels and looked at his hands, the hands that had been holding Cole Dawson's heart in rhythm for 11 minutes and 40-some seconds, and they were trembling in a way he couldn't entirely control. One of the paramedics clapped him on the shoulder. Did good, she said, already moving, already working. Ryan stood up. His knees hurt, his shoulders hurt, back hurt. The concrete had done what concrete does to knees, and it was going to remind him of this for days. He watched the paramedics work for a moment, watched the practiced efficiency of people who did this for a living take over, from the desperate, untrained determination that had kept things moving until they arrived. Watched Cole Dawson's big chest rise with assisted breath. Watched the equipment appear and function and do what equipment is supposed to do. He heard Cole's heart come back on the monitor with a sound like an argument being won. And then, before he'd had time to feel anything other than the shaking in his hands, he heard the voice. Victor Hale. Standing 6 feet away, arms crossed, with an expression that had moved past fury and arrived somewhere colder. You're done here, Victor said. Clean out your tools. I want you gone by tomorrow morning. Ryan looked at him. He wanted to say something. He could feel words forming somewhere in his throat, words that had been building for 2 years. Everything he'd swallowed during every moment, Victor had reminded him of what he owed. Every time the job had been used as a leash, every carefully calibrated humiliation dressed up as management. He didn't say any of them, he just nodded. Because here was the thing Ryan Carter understood in that moment, standing on aching knees with concrete dust on his hands, and the sound of Cole Dawson's heart on a monitor behind him, he would do it again. He would make the same choice 10 times out of 10, 100 times out of 100, every time the door opened and the decision sat in front of him. He would always choose the man on the floor. He would always keep his hands moving. He would always be the person who refused to look away. And if that cost him this room and this job and this carefully constructed system of survival he'd built out of nothing and a lot of quiet desperation, then it cost him those things. He had learned in 12 minutes on a concrete floor something it takes most people much longer to understand, that who you are doesn't come from what you own. It comes from what you do when keeping what you own would require you to become someone else. Ryan Carter picked up his shop rag. He cleaned his hands. He walked back to his station and finished catalog his tools because he was going to need every single one of them, and he intended to leave this place with exactly what was his and nothing that wasn't. Outside, through the open bay door, the afternoon sun was doing what it always did in Phoenix in June, hammering everything flat and hot and relentless, the way life hammers at the people it's decided to test. Ryan had been hammered for 20 years. He was still standing. Somewhere across the city, Cole Dawson was alive because of it. Ryan told himself that was enough. He told himself it had to be enough. Told himself this story was over and a new one would start tomorrow, different but survivable, the way all his stories had eventually turned out to be survivable. He was wrong. Not about the survival, about the story being over. Because 2 miles away, in the emergency room of Banner University Medical Center, a man with silver in his beard and 30 years of road behind him was waking up for the first time. The first question he asked was not about his condition, not about the tube in his arm or the monitor beeping beside him, not about his motorcycle, his brothers, or the miles he still had left to ride. The first question Cole Dawson asked, in a voice like gravel and thunder, looking at the nurse standing beside his bed with the particular focused attention of a man who had never once in his life asked a question he didn't intend to get answered, was this: who saved me? The nurse's name was Patricia. She had worked the cardiac unit at Banner University Medical Center for 19 years, and in those 19 years, she had watched a lot of people wake up from a lot of frightening things. She had developed a reliable sense for what a person's first question revealed about who they were. Most people woke up asking about themselves. What happened to me? Am I going to be okay? How long was I out? Those were the questions of people whose world, understandably, had contracted to the size of their own chest. Some people woke up asking about their families. Where's my wife? Did someone call my son? These were the questions of people whose love was bigger than their fear. And Patricia had always respected them. Cole Dawson woke up asking about a stranger. Who saved me? Not a question exactly. More like a demand delivered in a tone that made clear he intended to receive an answer and had the patience to wait exactly as long as it took. Patricia looked at the chart. She looked at the man. She said carefully, "Sir, you've just been through a significant cardiac event. You need to rest before." Patricia, he had read her name tag in approximately the 2 seconds it had been within his line of sight. "I understand what I've been through. I'll rest when you answer the question. Who saved me?" She told him what she knew, which wasn't much. The paramedics' notes said a bystander had performed CPR at the scene, a young male, early 20s, at a garage on West McDowell. No name on the report. 11 minutes and 43 seconds of CPR before the unit arrived. Paramedic notation at the bottom of the field report said, "Responder performed compressions with notable technique and composure. Subject's pulse restored prior to defibrillation." Cole read the notation twice. 11 minutes and 43 seconds, he said, mostly to himself. "Yes, on a concrete floor. That's what the report says." He was quiet for a long moment. The monitor beside him beeped its steady, mechanical rhythm. Eyes moved to the ceiling and stayed there, and whatever was moving behind them was private and deep and had nothing to do with ceiling tiles. Find out who he is, Cole said. Sir, that's not really something the hospital can. Patricia, again, the same tone, not unkind, just absolute. I understand your constraints. I'm asking you to make a phone call to the garage on West McDowell and ask them the name of the young man who performed CPR today. That's all I'm asking you to do. One phone call. She made the phone call. She got Victor Hale, who told her in a voice that managed to be both cooperative and cold simultaneously that the employee in question was named Ryan Carter, that he was 20 years old, and that he was, as of that afternoon, no longer employed at Desert Road Garage. Patricia relayed this information to Cole Dawson. She watched something move across his face that she later described to her colleague as the expression of a man who had just been handed something that confirmed a suspicion he'd been carrying for a while. Fired, Cole said, flat, like a word landing on a table. That's what the owner said. Yes. Cole said nothing for approximately 10 seconds. His jaw worked slightly, the way jaws do when a person is deciding between several things they might say and choosing the one that costs the least. For now. Get me my phone, he said. And whoever's handling my discharge paperwork, tell them I'll need the details about follow-up, because I intend to leave here as soon as medically responsible. Mr. Dawson, you had a cardiac arrest. The doctor recommends at minimum 48 hours of... I heard the doctor. I'll talk to the doctor. Right now I need my phone. She got him his phone. Cole made 3 calls. The first call lasted 4 minutes. The second lasted 7. The third lasted 9. The third lasted 90 seconds, and when it was done, Cole set the phone down on the blanket beside him and looked at the ceiling again. And this time there was something in his expression that looked, if Patricia had to name it, like the specific calm of a man who has set something into motion and is now simply waiting for it to arrive. Across the city, Ryan Carter was packing a backpack. He didn't have much to pack. That was the bitter comedy of the situation. The one advantage of spending your life with almost nothing is that losing almost nothing doesn't take very long. The backpack held everything. 3 changes of clothes, the first aid manual he'd been reading since he was 16, a small set of personal tools that were his and not the garage's, water bottle, the sock with $240 in it that he transferred carefully to the bottom of the bag's interior pocket. The room behind the motel was approximately 10 by 12 feet. It had a cot, a mini fridge that worked intermittently, a hot plate, and a bathroom that was technically functional if you adjusted your standards appropriately. For 2 years it had been home because it had a lock, and the lock was his, and nobody could take it away until today. Today, Victor could take it away. Ryan sat on the edge of the cot for a moment with the backpack between his feet and let himself feel it, the weight of what had happened, the specific gravity of being 20 years old and starting over from zero for what felt like the 100th time, even though, if he counted accurately, it was only the 7th or 8th, depending on how you counted. He didn't let himself feel it for long. That was another part of the system. Not suppression, not denial, just rationing. You let yourself feel the hard thing for a few minutes, you acknowledge that it's real, and it's bad, and it deserves to be felt, and then you put it somewhere that isn't the front of your mind, because the front of your mind needs to be clear for the next problem. The next problem was, where was he sleeping tonight? He went through the options. There was a shelter on Van Buren that he'd stayed in once, before it had a 30-day limit and required chicken by 7 p.m. He had enough money for a cheap motel for 3, maybe 4 nights if he was careful, but motels that took cash with no ID questions asked were not the kind of motels that made you feel safe when you were sleeping. There was a guy named Marcus, he'd done some work, for once, a freelance thing, who had mentioned Ryan could call him if he was ever in a bind, though that had been 8 months ago and people said things and then forgot they'd said them. The shelter was the most reliable option. He stood up. He picked up the backpack, took one look around the 10 by 12 room that had been his home for 2 years, and did not allow himself to be sentimental about it, because sentimentality was a luxury and he was currently operating well below that income bracket. He walked out the door. He walked around the side of the garage. And here was the thing about a small town inside a big city, which is what every neighborhood is. Really, the timing of things has a way of aligning in ways that feel designed even when they aren't. had, because Ryan walked out of that room at the exact moment that Delaney, still in his work clothes, was coming around the corner of the building, and they nearly walked into each other. Delaney stopped, looked at the backpack, read the situation in approximately 1 second. He actually did it, Delaney said, not a question. Yeah, Ryan said. You saved that man's life. I know. Victor fired you for it. I know. Delaney stared at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who has something to say and is working out whether to say it. That's wrong, he finally said. That's genuinely wrong. You know that, right? What you did, that was the right thing. That was the only right thing. I know, Ryan said for the third time. Then, because he didn't know what else to add and the afternoon wasn't getting any cooler. Take care of yourself, Delaney. He walked past him. Delaney called after him, Ryan. Man, do you need... I'm good, Ryan said without turning around. He wasn't good. He was the opposite of good. But accepting help from Delaney would mean Delaney would feel responsible. And Delaney had his own situation, and Ryan was not going to become someone else's weight to carry. That was a rule he'd made a long time ago, and he was keeping it. He made it 2 blocks before his phone buzzed. He didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer it. Unknown numbers were rarely good news in Ryan Carter's life. Something instinct, or maybe just the particular brand of curiosity that kicks in when you've already lost everything and are trying to figure out what's left, made him answer. This Ryan Carter. The voice was female, professional, calm. Who's asking? My name is Patricia. I'm a nurse at Banner University Medical Center, calling on behalf of a patient who's been asking about you. Ryan stopped walking. Cole Dawson is asking that you come see him, Patricia said. He was quite specific that I tell you it's not an obligation. He said to make sure you understood that. He wants to meet you. The silence on Ryan's end lasted long enough that Patricia said, Are you still there? Yeah, Ryan said. Yeah, I'm here. Can I tell him you'll come? Ryan stood on the sidewalk with a backpack on his shoulders and $240 to his name and the particular weight of a day that had already extracted more from him than most days extracted in a week. And he thought about it. Tell him I'll come, Ryan said. He hailed a bus. The bus ride to Banner took 22 minutes, and Ryan spent most of it looking out the window and not thinking about anything in particular, which was a skill he'd developed over years of bus rides and waiting rooms and the long blank hours of transition between one place and the next. Not thinking is an underrated skill. Most people can't do it. Fill every silence with noise, every gap with worry. Ryan had learned to go quiet inside when the outside was loud, which made him very good at waiting and very uncomfortable in stillness that he hadn't chosen for himself. Checked in at the desk with Cole's name and was walked to a room on the 3rd floor by a different nurse, younger one, who looked at the backpack and said nothing, which Ryan appreciated. Stood in the doorway of room 317 for just a moment before he went in. Cole Dawson was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking like a man who resented every aspect of the situation except the part where he was alive. The monitors were still on. The IV was still in his arm. He was a large man in a small bed, and he wore it with the particular dignity of someone who has decided that circumstances do not define him. He looked at Ryan when he came in, and his expression did something complicated, not quite emotion, but the controlled approach to it, the look of a man who has strong feelings and has spent 60 years learning to carry them without spilling them. Ryan Carter, Cole said. Mr. Dawson, Ryan said. Sit down. Ryan sat in the chair beside the bed. They looked at each other for a moment. There was something in that moment, in the specific quality of the silence between them, that neither of them had a word for, and neither of them needed one. 11 minutes, Cole said. Closer to 12, Ryan said. Something that might have been a smile moved across Cole's face very briefly. Patricia gave me the exact count. 11:43. He shifted in the bed, adjusting his position in the way of someone whose body has recently betrayed him and who is negotiating a new understanding with it. You knew what you were doing. I had training. Where? Group home. Standard first aid course. 7 years ago. Cole absorbed this. The way he absorbed information was notable, slowly, completely, without visibly reacting to it until he'd processed it all the way through. Group home, he repeated, and it wasn't a judgment, just a fact being confirmed and filed. I aged out of foster care at 18, Ryan said. He wasn't sure why he said it. He almost never said it. Maybe it was the weight of the day making the usual filters temporarily insufficient. Maybe it was something about Cole Dawson's particular way of receiving information without flinching. PPPP without the particular awkward kindness that people deployed when they didn't know what to do with your story. Been in Phoenix since then, working at the garage. Were, Cole said. Were, Ryan agreed. He fired you, Cole said. Victor Hale fired you for saving my life. He fired me for leaving my station, Ryan said, because that was technically the official version, and Ryan had spent enough time around people who held power to know that the official version was usually the one that survived, and he didn't particularly want to spend energy fighting it. Cole looked at him for a long moment. Don't do that, he said. Ryan looked up. Don't reframe it to make it easier for someone else to swallow, Cole said. He fired you for saving my life. Say it like that. Ryan held his gaze. He fired me for saving your life. Yes, he did, Cole said. And I want you to understand something, Ryan. I want you to understand it clearly because I don't say things twice. What you did today staying on that floor, not stopping, not looking away, that's not a small thing. That's not something most people do. Most people back off when someone with authority tells them to. Most people, good people, decent people, not cowards, they back off. Because backing off is rational. Because the cost is real and the person on the floor is a stranger. He paused. Didn't back off, no. Ryan said, why not? The question sat between them. Ryan thought about it the way he thought about things he hadn't fully articulated yet, slowly, from the inside out, trying to find the actual reason rather than the version that sounded good. Because I knew what it felt like to be the person people walked past, he said finally. Been that person. My whole life I've been that person, and I couldn't be the one who did that to someone else. Cole didn't say anything for a while. The monitor beeped. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened and closed. I want to ask you something, Cole said, and I want the honest answer, not the one that saves face. Okay, where are you sleeping tonight? Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. Not much, but enough. I'll figure something out, he said. That's not what I asked. Ryan looked at the window. I have options, he said, Ryan. The way Cole said his name had a particular quality, not commanding, not pitying. Something in between. The way you say someone's name when you want them to know you're actually paying attention and not just waiting for your turn to speak. I don't know yet, Ryan said finally. Probably the shelter on Van Buren if there's space. Otherwise, I'll find something. Cole nodded slowly. He reached toward the bedside table, picked up his phone, and held it loosely in one hand the way someone holds something they're deciding whether to use. I'm going to make some calls, Cole said. Not charity. I want to be clear about that because I have a feeling you wouldn't take charity. Ryan said nothing, which was its own kind of confirmation. There are people I know, Cole said. People who know what it means when someone does what you did. People who value the thing you showed today more than most people value anything. I want to make some calls and I want to see what's possible. That's all this is right now. Possibility. Are you willing to let me do that? Ryan sat with it. He sat with the reflexive resistance that had gotten him through 20 years of situations where accepting help had strings attached, or didn't last, or turned into something he owed indefinitely. He sat with the particular pride that was part armor and part identity. The pride of a person who had survived by never needing anybody, which meant never being vulnerable to anybody. He sat with the other thing, the thing underneath all of it, exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a person who has been operating at maximum self-sufficiency for so long that the muscles required for it are starting to tear. Yeah, Ryan said. Okay. Cole made the calls. Ryan sat in the chair and listened to one side of three conversations that didn't mean much to him individually, but whose combined trajectory he could feel building towards something, the way you can feel a weather change in the pressure of the air before any cloud appears. The third call was the shortest. Cole said, it's Cole. I'm at Banner. Cardiac, Pa, I know, I'm fine. Listen, I need you to hear something. There's a kid here, 20 years old, mechanic, no place to sleep tonight. Kept my heart going for 12 minutes on a concrete floor. Victor Hale fired him for it. Another pause longer. Yeah, that's what I said. Another pause. Then I figured you would. I'll have his number to you in an hour. He hung up. He looked at Ryan. You got a working phone, he said. Yeah. Give me the number. Ryan gave it to him. Cole typed it into his phone with the deliberate attention of a man who did not multitask. There's a shop, he said. Good shop. Owner named James Reynolds. I've known him 20 years. He knows bikes the way you know bikes. He's got a position open, and he's been looking for someone who actually gives a damn. Vouched for you. The rest is up to you. Ryan stared at him. There's also a room, Cole continued, in the same even tone. Above the shop. Reynolds rents it cheap to whoever's working there. It's not charity. He takes it out of your pay at a rate that's fair. And you'll see that it's fair when you look at what he's paying. You can look at the numbers and decide. Ryan's mouth had gone slightly dry. Why, he said. Cole looked at him. Say it like a complete sentence. Why are you doing this, Ryan said. Cole set his phone down on the blanket. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, the evenness in his voice had something underneath it that hadn't been there before, something older and more personal. Because 60 years ago, give or take, I was a 16-year-old kid with nowhere to go and no one looking for me, Cole said. And a man I barely knew gave me a chance that he didn't have to give me. Didn't ask for anything in return. Didn't make me feel small for needing it. Just opened a door. He looked at Ryan steadily. That man's been gone for 22 years. The only way I ever found to pay that back was to do the same thing when it came in front of me. He paused. You came in front of me today, Ryan, in about the most direct way a person can come in front of another person. Ryan looked at his hands, the hands that had kept this man's heart moving. They'd stopped shaking a few hours ago, but he could still feel the ghost of the rhythm in them, the muscle memory of compression and release. I don't know how to, he stopped. Started again. I'm not good at. You don't have to say anything, Cole said. Just go to the shop tomorrow morning at 9. Reynolds is expecting you. Show him what you showed me today, which is that you know what you're doing and you don't stop when it gets hard. Ryan stood up. He picked up his backpack, stood there for a moment with everything he owned on his back, and looked at the man in the hospital bed, the man who was alive. Because Ryan had refused to let himself succumb, someone who looked away, and something moved through him that was too complicated and too large for the moment, and he let it pass without trying to name it. Get some rest, Ryan said. Cole almost smiled. You sound like Patricia. Patricia's right. Usually, Cole said, not always. But usually, Ryan turned to go. Ryan, he turned back. Cole looked at him with the particular look of a man who has been around long enough to know the difference between a person who'll be okay and a person who won't, and has learned to tell them apart by something that isn't anything you can measure. You did the right thing today, Cole said. I want you to know that somebody sees that. Somebody who matters is telling you that what you did was right and it cost you, and you should never have to pay that price, and I'm sorry that you did. He held Ryan's gaze. And I want you to remember this feeling, not the hard part, not the losing your job part, the part before that, the 12 minutes on the floor. Remember what it felt like to be certain. Ryan didn't answer, but he remembered. He rode the bus to the shelter on Van Buren and checked in before 7 p.m. and lay in a bunk in a room with 11 other people and stared at the ceiling for a long time before sleep came. And in the space before sleep, he held on to that, the certainty, the strange, costly, absolute certainty of a person who had looked at an impossible choice and found, without searching for it, that the choice was already made. He didn't know, lying there in that shelter bunk, what was coming. He didn't know about the phone calls Cole had made that evening that went beyond James Reynolds in a room above a shop. He didn't know about the message that moved through a network that had its own geography and its own language and its own understanding of what loyalty meant and what it demanded. He didn't know that by the time the sun came up, his name had been spoken in conversations across Phoenix that he would never be aware of. He didn't know that somewhere in the city, engines were warming up. He didn't know that the sound of motorcycles was already building. He simply closed his eyes and slept. And in the morning he got up and he went to Reynolds' shop at 9 o'clock exactly, because that was what Cole had asked him to do. And Ryan Carter did not break his word to people who had earned it. James Reynolds opened the door at 8:59, looked Ryan up and down, looked at the backpack, said, Cole called me last night, told me what happened, all of it. Okay, Ryan said. You want to know what he said at the end of the call? What did he say? Reynolds leaned against the doorframe. He was a lean man in his 50s with oil-stained hands that told you he still did his own work. which Ryan respected immediately and without reservation. He said, "James, this kid has more character in one hand than most people carry their whole lives. Don't screw this up by making him feel like he owes you something." Reynolds paused. "So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you the shop and tell you what the position pays and tell you about the room and let you decide. Fair?" Ryan exhaled something he'd been holding since the previous afternoon. "Fair," he said. He walked into the shop and he did not look back. Reynolds' shop was called Mesa Ironworks, and it smelled the way all serious shops smell: oil and metal and the faint trace of burned rubber that gets into the walls and never entirely leaves. Ryan noticed the smell when he walked in and felt something in his chest loosen slightly, the way it always did when he entered a space where the work was real and the tools were honest and the problems had solutions you could find with your hands. Reynolds gave him the tour in about 10 minutes flat. Ceremony, no sales pitch. Just here's the lift, here's the parts inventory system, here's where the customer files live, here's the bay you'll be working out of, here's the bathroom. Don't leave coffee cups on the workbench. It was the tour of a man who believed in economy of language and respected people enough to assume they could keep up. "What's your strongest area?" Reynolds asked, standing in the middle of the bay with his arms crossed. "Brakes, suspension, engine diagnostics." Ryan said, "Solid on electrical, but it's not my first love." "What's your first love?" Ryan thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Engine work. When something sounds wrong and nobody else can hear it yet." Reynolds looked at him for a moment. "Cole said you identified a caliper issue on his Road King just by looking at the brake setup." "Wear pattern was off," Ryan said. "It wasn't hard once you knew what to look for. Most guys with 10 years on them wouldn't have caught that from a standing position before they'd even picked up a tool," Reynolds said. "Not flattery, just assessment, delivered the same way you'd read a gauge. Rooms upstairs, staircase through that door. It's clean, it's quiet, the lock works. Rent comes out of your check at $280 a month, which is less than a third of what you'd pay anywhere else in this zip code. And you know it." "I know it," Ryan said. "The pay is $22 an hour to start. You demonstrate what Cole says you can demonstrate, that number moves. I don't make promises I don't keep, and I don't hold numbers back when someone earns them." "Any questions?" Ryan had approximately 40 questions, but only one that mattered in this moment. "When do I start?" Reynolds almost smiled. "You're already started. There's a Sportster in Bay 2 that needs a full engine teardown. Owner thinks it's a top-end issue. Tell me what you find." Ryan set his backpack against the wall, rolled up his sleeves, and went to work. He didn't think about Victor Hale. He didn't think about the shelter bunk he'd woken up in 2 hours ago. He didn't think about the $240 in his pocket that was no longer a thing standing between him and nothing. Thought about the Sportster and what the engine was telling him and what the tools in his hands were showing him, and for the first time in a long time, the thinking felt clean. 3 hours later, Reynolds came and stood at the edge of the bay and looked at what Ryan had found. It wasn't a top-end issue. It was a failing crankcase breather valve that had been directing blow-by into the air cleaner, causing a rich condition that was loading up the top end with carbon. The owner had been chasing a symptom. Ryan had found the cause. Reynolds stood there for a long time. "The last guy I had in this bay," Reynolds said finally, "would have rebuilt the top end, charged the customer for the parts, handed the bike back, and the same problem would have come back in 6 weeks." "I know," Ryan said. "I've seen it done." "How long have you been doing this?" "Seriously, since I was 12. Reynolds nodded slowly, the nod of a man updating a prior estimate. He didn't say much else. He didn't need to. He walked back to his office and Ryan heard him pick up the phone and heard him say, in a low voice that wasn't quite private but wasn't meant to be shared, "Cole." "Yeah, he's here." "Yeah." A pause. "No, I'm calling to tell you that you undersold him." Ryan kept his face directed at the engine, but he heard it. Something in his chest, in the place where the exhaustion had been living for 2 years, shifted a fraction of an inch towards something that didn't have a name yet, but felt tentatively like the beginning of solid ground. That was day 1. Days 2 through 14 were more of the same, and the sameness was, for Ryan, its own kind of revelation. Not dramatic, not miraculous. Just consistent work that mattered, done in a space where it was recognized for a wage that was fair, in a room with a lock that was his. He showed up early, and left late, and Reynolds noticed both without making a production of either. The other mechanic at the shop, a guy named Terrence, who was 35 and had been with Reynolds for 8 years, initially approached Ryan with the professional wariness of someone protecting his turf, then within a week shifted to the professional respect of someone who recognizes a peer. "You hear what Victor Hale's doing?" Terrence said one afternoon, cleaning his hands at the sink. "Telling people around town that you were a liability risk. You performed unauthorized medical intervention on a customer, and it could have gone bad, and that's why he had to let you go." Ryan worked his wrench and said nothing. "That bother you?" Terrence said. "Not particularly," Ryan said. "It should. That's your reputation he's playing with." Ryan set the wrench down and looked at Terrence. "Victor Hale's version of what happened lives in Victor Hale's world," he said. "I know what happened. Cole Dawson knows what happened. The paramedics who read the report know what happened. I'm not going to spend energy fighting a narrative when I can spend it doing work." He picked up the wrench again. "The truth doesn't need me to defend it. It just needs me to keep showing up." Terrence looked at him for a moment. "How old did you say you were?" 20. "You talk like someone who's been 50 for a while," Terrence said. Ryan almost laughed. It was a near thing close enough that the corner of his mouth moved. What he didn't know what he had no way of knowing from the inside of Reynolds' shop focused on engines and the mechanics of a life slowly reassembling itself was what was happening outside. Cole had been discharged from Banner 6 days after his admission. He'd gone home, followed the cardiologist's instructions to a degree that satisfied the minimum requirements while allowing him to move around, and he'd made calls. Not a few calls. Many calls, careful and deliberate, in the way that Cole did everything with complete attention and without wasted motion. Talked to brothers he hadn't spoken to in months. Had talked to chapter leaders in 3 different cities. Told the story of Ryan Carter the same way each time, without embellishment, because the unembellished version was already more than enough. The story moved the way stories move through tight communities fast, and charged and carrying a weight that pure information never carries. Because it wasn't just a story about a young man performing CPR. It was a story about a young man with nothing choosing to do the right thing when doing the right thing cost him everything he had. And in a community built entirely on the principle that loyalty was proven by what you did when it was costly. That story landed with the particular force of something that confirmed everything they believed about what mattered. Cole sat with Danny Walker, the chapter president, a man who wore his authority the way old trees wear their age, without announcing it in the living room of Danny's house. 3 days after Cole got home, he told the story straight through without interruption. When he finished, Danny was quiet for a long time. "You said he's 20, Danny said. 20 years old, Cole confirmed. He's out of the system at 18, been on his own since. Works like someone twice his age and has the instincts of someone who was born reading engines. Victor Hale fired him," Danny said, "on the same afternoon. Before I was even out of the parking lot in the ambulance." Danny turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow rotation that Ryan's hands would have recognized as the physical expression of deep thinking. "What does he need?" he said. "He needs what James Reynolds is already giving him," Cole said. "A real job, a fair wage, a room. He doesn't need a handout. He needs the thing to keep being real. He needs to know that this time it isn't going to be pulled out from under him." He paused. And I think he needs to know that somebody's paying attention, not watching over him, not babying him, just acknowledging that what he did was seen. Danny nodded. "I want to go see him," Danny said. Cole looked at him. "When?" "Soon," Danny said. And the way he said it meant it wasn't a casual intention. It meant he'd already decided and was now managing the logistics of the decision. 3 days later, Ryan was under a Harley Ultra Classic doing an oil change and a primary chain inspection when he heard Reynolds' voice from the front of the shop. "Ryan, can you come out front for a minute?" Something in Reynolds' tone was different from its usual even register. Not alarmed, not nervous exactly, but aware of something, the way you're aware of a change in pressure. Ryan slid out from under the bike, wiped his hands, and walked to the front. There were 2 men standing in the reception area. One of them was Cole Dawson, which Ryan had half expected. Cole had been by twice in the past 2 weeks, once to check on the shop And once Ryan suspected to check on him, though Cole had been careful to frame both visits as pure business. The other man Ryan did not know. He was older than Cole, perhaps 65, with a gray beard trimmed closer, and eyes that had the particular quality of eyes that had seen a very long time of things and developed strong opinions about most of them. He wore the same leather vest, the same patches. He had Cole's height and none of Cole's weight, and all of Cole's presence, maybe more, because it was concentrated into a leaner frame and seemed, as a result, to have nowhere to dissipate. Cole said, "Ryan, this is Danny Walker." Ryan shook the man's hand and learned immediately that his grip told you everything about how he approached the world firm and without performance. "Cole's told me about you," Danny said. "I figured," Ryan said. "He tends not to exaggerate," Danny said. "I've known him long enough to know when he's being accurate and when he's being generous." He was being accurate. Ryan didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which turned out to be the right choice. "I wanted to meet you," Danny said. "That's the whole reason I came. I wanted to look at the person who kept one of my brothers alive and made a decision that most people, with a lot more than you had, wouldn't have made." He held Ryan's gaze. "And I wanted to say something to your face instead of letting it get said through other people." "Okay," Ryan said. "What you did was right," Danny said. "I know Cole probably told you that already. I know the paramedics told you that. But I'm telling you from a particular position as someone who has been in this world a long time and has watched a lot of people make a lot of choices when the stakes were real. What you did was right. It cost you, shouldn't have cost you, and I'm sorry that it did. That's all. I just needed to say that." Ryan felt something in his throat that he was going to absolutely refuse to give into in front of these two men. "Thank you," he said. His voice was level. He'd made it level by the kind of internal effort that doesn't show on the outside. "There's something else," Cole said. Ryan looked at him. "The chapter wants to do something," Cole said. "Not charity, I already know your position on that. Something else, a gesture, a gathering, a way of acknowledging what happened publicly among people who understand what it means." He paused. "We want to bring some people by the shop. Let them meet you. That's all it is. Is that something you'd allow?" Ryan looked from Cole to Danny and back. "How many people?" he said. Danny's expression moved fractionally. "Enough," he said. Ryan didn't ask a follow-up question because he had learned to read the space between words, and the space between Danny Walker's words was telling him that enough was not a small number. "When," Ryan said. "Saturday," Cole said. Ryan nodded. He went back to the Ultra Classics, slid back under it, and lay there on the creeper in the familiar dark underneath the bike, and let himself think about what was coming. Not with fear, not with excitement exactly. With the particular alert stillness of someone who has learned that the moments right before things change have a specific texture, quieter than the moments before and louder than anything that follows. Saturday came. Reynolds opened the shop at 8 as usual. Ryan was already there at 7:30, had been since before dawn, working through a stack of service orders he'd wanted to get ahead of. Terrence came in at 8. By 9, the three of them were in a normal rhythm. The shop doing what shops do on a Saturday morning, steady, purposeful, the accumulated sound of work being done. 10:15, Reynolds looked up from the front desk and said very quietly, "Ryan." Ryan looked up. He heard it before he saw anything. One engine. The sound of it was unmistakable, not because of its volume, but because of its character. Particular low register of a Harley-Davidson V-twin that had been built right and maintained right and was being ridden on by someone who knew what they were doing. It came down the street at a moderate pace, not aggressive, not performing. Then a second engine joined it, then a third. Terrence had come to stand beside Ryan without either of them deciding to do it. He was looking at the bay entrance with an expression Ryan had never seen on him before. "How many did Cole say were coming?" Terrence said. "He didn't give me a number," Ryan said. The engines kept coming. 10, 20, 30. The sound built not like an explosion, but like a tide, gradual, overwhelming, impossible to separate into individual parts after a certain point. Filled the street outside the bay door, filled the block, filled the air in a way that Ryan felt in his chest as much as heard with his ears. Reynolds came out of his office and stood in the doorway and said absolutely nothing. Terrence said under his breath, "Ryan, man." Ryan walked to the bay entrance. He stopped. The street was full of motorcycles, Harleys mostly, but others too, every make and model that belonged to people who lived and moved in that world. They were parked in rows that extended as far as Ryan could see in both directions. Riders standing beside their bikes or leaning on them in leather and denim and patches. Some talking to each other, some just standing quietly. All of them facing the shop. He could not have told you how many there were. Dozens. More than dozens. The kind of number that stops being a count and starts being a crowd. Cole was at the front. He stood 20 feet from the bay entrance, his arms relaxed at his sides, and he looked at Ryan with an expression that had let go of all its usual control and was just open. Present, Danny Walker was beside him. Beside Danny were men and women that Ryan didn't know and would learn over time, chapter leaders and longtime members, and people who had driven from other cities because the story had reached them and the story had mattered. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Ryan stood in the bay entrance with oil on his hands and a shop rag in his back pocket, and looked at the crowd of people looking at him. And something inside him, something he'd been keeping carefully managed for years, the part of him that had learned early that needing people was dangerous and depending on anyone was a vulnerability he couldn't afford, cracked. Not collapsed, not shattered. Cracked. In the way that things crack when pressure has been applied for a very long time from the wrong direction, and finally something gives, and what's revealed underneath the crack is not weakness, but the thing the pressure was trying to break and couldn't. Danny Walker walked forward. He stopped 6 feet from Ryan. "You don't know most of these people," Danny said. His voice carried the way voices carry when they're used to being heard without a microphone. "They know you. They know what you did. They came because in this world, in the life we live, what you showed on that garage floor is the thing that matters most. Not strength, not toughness, loyalty to someone you barely knew. The cost of everything you had." He paused. "That's not a common thing. And we don't let uncommon things go unacknowledged." Cole stepped forward and stood beside Danny. "You thought you were nobody," Cole said, and his voice was quiet enough that it was just for Ryan, just for this moment between the two of them. "You thought that because someone needed you to believe that, because it was convenient for certain people if you believed that." He stopped, held Ryan's gaze. "You were wrong. And I think part of you knew you were wrong every time you made the right call anyway. Every time you kept your hands moving." Ryan's jaw was tight. His hands were still. He was 20 years old, standing in the entrance of a garage with $200 less in his pocket than he'd had a week ago, and more people looking at him with something that was not pity and not charity but genuine human recognition than had ever been pointed his direction simultaneously in his entire life. And he thought not in words, but in the particular way that deep realizations arrive, below language, in the part of you that knows things before your mind catches up. He thought about every time he'd been invisible, every waiting room where nobody met his eye, every placement that ended without a conversation, every morning at Desert Road Garage where Victor Hale had looked at him and seen a tool, a resource, a problem to be managed. He thought about 12 minutes on a concrete floor. He understood, for the first time completely, what Cole had told him in the hospital room. Remember what it felt like to be certain. He'd been certain on that floor, certain in a way he'd never been certain before. Not about the outcome, not about Cole surviving, not about anything practical or measurable. Certain about who he was and what he was going to do about it. Certain that the choice in front of him was already made and had been made, probably, long before that afternoon, in every moment he'd ever kept going when stopping would have been easier. He looked at Cole. He looked at Danny. He looked at the crowd of people in the street who had come to this garage on a Saturday morning in June to acknowledge a 20-year-old mechanic with a backpack and $240 and the absolute refusal to become someone who looked away. "Don't know what to say," Ryan said. Danny nodded. "You don't have to say anything." "That's kind of you," Ryan said. "But I want to say something." The crowd had gone quiet, the way crowds go quiet when they sense that something worth hearing is about to be said. Ryan looked at Cole. "You asked me in the hospital why I didn't stop," Ryan said. "Gave you an answer and it was true, but it wasn't complete." He stopped, started again. "The complete answer is I didn't stop because stopping would have meant becoming someone I couldn't come back from. Not because I'm brave. I'm not particularly brave, but because I've been the person on the floor. Not a cardiac arrest, but the other kind, the invisible kind, And I know what it does to you when the people around you decide you're not worth the risk. He paused. I wasn't going to do that to him, that's all. Cole's jaw moved. Danny looked at the ground for a moment. From somewhere in the crowd, a man Ryan had never met cleared his throat and said, roughly, that'll do. Someone laughed, a real laugh. The kind that releases something and then other people were laughing too. And the particular tension that had been held in the air dissolved into something warmer and more human, and people started moving, coming forward, introductions being made in the chaotic, organic way of a gathering where nobody's running an agenda. Hands were shaken. Names were exchanged. Someone brought food sandwiches in a stack of bags, enough for everyone, and then some. Reynolds appeared from inside the shop with folding chairs that Ryan had never seen before and wasn't sure where he'd found them, and set them up outside the bay door. The gathering reorganized itself around them in the unplanned way of people who know how to be together. Ryan sat in one of those chairs and talked to people and answered questions and asked some of his own. An hour passed, and then another, and somewhere in that time he noticed something. He was not managing the interaction. He was not calculating what to say or withholding information or looking for the angle. He was just talking with people who were talking back like a normal person in a normal gathering who did not have to armor himself against the environment. It was the most disorienting feeling he'd had in years. Cole appeared beside him at one point and sat down in the empty chair to his left and handed him a paper cup of coffee. "How are you doing?" Cole said. "I don't have a reference point for this," Ryan said honestly. "That's normal," Cole said. "Give it time." Ryan drank the coffee. It was good coffee, better than anything he'd had access to at the old garage, which was another tiny data point on the accumulating evidence that things were different now. "Victor Hale called Reynolds this morning," Cole said. Casual in tone, not casual in content. Ryan looked at him sharply. "He heard about today," Cole said. Apparently word travels faster than he expected. Called to tell Reynolds that Ryan Carter was a liability risk and a former employee with behavioral issues, and that if Reynolds knew what was good for his business, he'd reconsider the hire. Ryan's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "Reynolds told him," Cole said, with a quality in his voice that was as close to satisfaction as Cole Dawson seemed to get, that he'd take it under advisement. And then he hung up. Ryan set the cup down. Is that going to be a problem?" Ryan said. "For Reynolds. If Victor Hale threatening James Reynolds is roughly equivalent to a Chihuahua threatening a large, impatient dog," Cole said. "Reynolds has been in this business for 30 years. His reputation is built on the quality of his work and the character of the people he employs. Victor can say whatever he likes. The people who matter know exactly what happened on June 14th. He looked at Ryan steadily. "And as of today, there are considerably more people in that category." Ryan looked at the crowd still gathered outside. 30, 40 people, some of whom were already getting ready to leave. The natural ebb of a gathering that has done what it came to do. The sound of engines starting was beginning to build again, the tide reversing, the road calling people back. Before they went, before the last bike pulled away, and the street returned to its ordinary Saturday volume, something happened that Ryan did not expect and would remember for the rest of his life. Danny Walker stood at the entrance to the bay and turned to face the remaining crowd, said, in the carrying voice of a man who has presided over these moments before we go. The crowd quieted. Danny looked at Ryan. "We don't do things lightly," Danny said. "We don't show up for people lightly. We don't give words lightly." He paused. "Ryan Carter, what you showed on that floor is what we spend our entire lives trying to be. We want you to know, all of us, every person standing here, that you are not nobody. You never were. And from this day, if you ever need anything, you call. Not as charity, as a brother calls a brother, because that's what you earned. 12 minutes on a concrete floor." The crowd responded not with cheers, not with performance, with something quieter and more substantial. A sound of agreement that moved through them like something that had been decided together without a vote. Ryan sat in his folding chair and received it. He sat very still and received it the way you receive something you have been waiting for a long time, without knowing you were waiting for it. Cole leaned over and said very quietly, "You okay?" Ryan looked at the engines warming up in the street. He looked at his hands, the hands that knew how to fix things, that knew how to keep things running, that knew how to keep things running. That the right tool applied at the right moment with the right pressure could change the outcome of almost anything. Thought about 12 minutes on a concrete floor in June. Thought about a sock with $240 in it. Thought about the shelter on Van Buren and Reynolds' shop. In a room with a lock that was his and a wage that was fair, and a man named Cole Dawson who had woken up in a hospital and asked, before anything else, who saved me. Looked at Cole. Yeah, Ryan Carter said. And for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, it was true without qualification. The weeks after the gathering had a different texture than anything Ryan had experienced before, and it took him a while to identify what exactly was different about them. Wasn't the work at Mesa Iron Works was demanding and consistent and exactly the kind of challenge his hands and mind needed. Wasn't the room above the shop, which had become, quietly and without ceremony, the first place in Ryan Carter's life that felt genuinely his. It wasn't even the money, though the honest wage Reynolds paid him was changing the mathematics of his daily existence in ways that were still new enough to feel almost theoretical. What was different was the weight, or rather the absence of it. For 2 years at Desert Road Garage, Ryan had carried a specific kind of weight, the weight of a person who exists inside a system designed to keep him exactly where he is, never lower but never higher, always just stable enough to stay and just desperate enough not to leave. He hadn't known how much that weight cost him until it was gone. Till he woke up in the morning without calculating whether he could afford to eat a real breakfast. Till he finished a job and felt Reynolds look it over and say good work, and understood that those 2 words came without an agenda attached to them. He was still learning what it felt like to not be managed. Terrence noticed the change before Ryan did. They were 3 weeks out from the Saturday's gathering, and Terrence was leaning against the workbench watching Ryan work through a complicated ignition timing issue on an older Dyna, and he said, without preamble, different than you were when you walked in here. Ryan kept working. Different how? Lighter, Terrence said. You walked in here like a man carrying something invisible, and now you're still carrying something, but it's a different shape. Ryan considered this. That's surprisingly poetic for a Tuesday morning. I'm a surprising person, Terrence said. You talked to Cole lately? Stopped by Friday. How's he doing with the cardiac stuff? Following the protocol. Complaining about it. Reynolds told me he called twice last week just to ask about specific jobs we had in the Bay, which Reynolds says is Cole's way of staying connected to normal life without admitting he misses the road. Terrence laughed. That sounds about right. What about he paused, choosing his words carefully, the other situation. Hale Ryan's hands slowed slightly, then resumed. What about it? I heard something, Terrence said. The way he said it indicated that what he'd heard was not small. Ryan set down his tool and turned to look at it. Terrence had the expression of someone carrying information they're not entirely sure how to deliver. A couple of guys came in yesterday while you were doing the road test on the Softail. Former employees of Desert Road Garage. They didn't come for service. Came to talk to Reynolds. Ryan waited. Apparently, Terrence said, you're not the first person Victor Hale pulled that move on. The room and job package. The deliberate underpay. The firing when someone stepped out of line. There have been others. At least 4 that these guys know about personally. Younger guys without a lot of options, guys he knew couldn't fight back. He paused. They heard about what happened to you. And apparently, the fact that it happened publicly enough, with enough witnesses, was the thing that finally made them think somebody might actually listen if they came forward. Ryan was very still. They're talking to a labor attorney, Terrence said. Reynolds put them in touch with someone he knows. They want to file a formal complaint with the labor board. Wage theft, unsafe working conditions, wrongful termination. He paused again. They want to know if you'd be willing to give a statement. The silence in the bay had the quality of something expanding. Ryan thought about Victor Hale. He thought about the particular geometry of the power. Victor wielded how it required the silence of the people it had damaged, how it depended on each person believing they were alone in what had happened to them, how it collapsed the moment the people it had used figured out they were not alone and never had been. He thought about a 17-year-old version of himself walking through that garage door with a backpack and a half-second hesitation that had told Victor everything he needed to know. Yes, Ryan said. His voice was flat and certain. Tell them yes. Terrence nodded. I figured, he said. But Terrence, Ryan said. Yeah, I'm not doing it for revenge. Terrence held his gaze. I know. That's why I've... Ryan picked up his tool and went back to the ignition timing, and the work was the same as it had been 30 seconds before, but something in the room had shifted. The way a room shifts when a decision that's been forming finally becomes a fact. The labor attorney's name was Sandra Reeves, and she met Ryan at a coffee shop on a Thursday afternoon with a legal pad and the particular kind of focused attention that good attorneys deploy, complete, non-judgmental, organized. She had already talked to the 4 former employees. She wanted Ryan's account directly, in his own words, in the sequence it happened. He told her all of it, the room arrangement, the wage structure, the way Victor had calibrated the pay never quite low enough to constitute a clear violation, always just enough to keep the person in place, the way he'd used personal information people shared against them later, the firing. Sandra Reeves wrote steadily and said almost nothing until he finished. Did he ever put the wage arrangement in writing? She asked. No. Did he document the room rental formally? No. Did any of this go through payroll with proper deductions and categorizations? Ryan looked at her. If I answer that question, is the answer going to matter? It's going to matter a great deal, she said. Then no, Ryan said. None of it was documented properly. He paid me in a way that kept my effective wage below what he recorded on paper. Sandra Reeves looked at him over the legal pad with an expression that was professionally neutral but contained, around the edges, something that was not neutrality. Ryan, she said, how long did you say you were there? 2 years. And the others, the 4 who came forward, they're talking about periods ranging from 8 months to 3 years each. She put the pen down. What Victor Hale has been running is not a loose or informal arrangement. It's a system, a deliberate design system for extracting maximum work from people in vulnerable positions at below market rates with no documentation that could be used against him. She paused. The labor board is going to be interested in this. Very interested. Ryan nodded. I want to be clear about something, he said. Whatever comes out of this, whatever consequence Hale faces, I'm not involved because I want to see him punished. I'm involved because there are probably more people behind me after me that he's already looking for. If this stops that, then it's worth my time. Sandra Reeves looked at him for a long moment. How old are you? She said. 20, Ryan said. She picked the pen back up. All right, she said. Let's get your statement on paper. He came back to the shop and found Cole's Road King parked outside, which meant Cole was inside, which meant Cole had heard something, because Cole had an information network that Ryan was still mapping the dimensions of and suspected was considerably larger than it appeared. Cole was in Reynolds' office, sitting in the spare chair with a coffee cup, which was a comfortable enough posture to suggest he'd been there a while. Reynolds was behind his desk. When Ryan appeared in the doorway, they both looked at him with a particular synchronized attention of people who have been discussing the person who just walked in. Sandra Reeves, Cole said. Not a question. Word travels, Ryan said. Does, Cole agreed. She's good. Sharp. She handled a situation for someone I know 3 years ago, and she was excellent. I know she's good, Ryan said. I wasn't looking for your endorsement. Cole's mouth moved slightly. I know. I was offering it anyway. Ryan leaned in the doorway. Is there something specific you came to tell me, or is this a general check-in? Cole and Reynolds exchanged a brief look, the kind of look that has communication in it. Hale knows you gave a statement, Reynolds said. Ryan straightened slightly. How? One of the former employees has a friend who's still working there, Reynolds said. Word got back. Ryan processed this. How is Hale responding? The way small men respond to things that threaten them, Cole said. He's making noise, telling people in his network that you're orchestrating some kind of harassment campaign. You're bitter about being fired, and you're using the CPR situation to make yourself look sympathetic. He paused. He's also been calling around to other shops in the area, suggesting that hiring you was a mistake and implying that you're, in his words, the kind of person who creates problems wherever he goes. The specific ugliness of it settled in the room. Ryan stood with it. He had known, intellectually, that this was how people like Victor operated when they felt threatened. They weaponized the narrative. They attacked the person who had spoken. They tried to make the problem about the complainer rather than the complaint. He had known this, but knowing it intellectually and feeling it aimed at you were different things. Is it working, Ryan said. His voice was level, the campaign. Is anyone listening to him? Reynolds and Cole exchanged that look again. Some people, Reynolds said carefully, in his immediate circle. People who've worked with him and have their own reasons to prefer the current version of events. Cole said, and the single syllable had the weight of what came after it, already loaded into it. The people who matter know exactly what happened. People who matter have considerably more credibility in this community than Victor Hale. He held Ryan's gaze. Don't engage with it. Don't defend yourself. Do your work. Let the process do what the process does. Can you do that? Ryan thought about it honestly. Honest in a way he wouldn't have been with anyone else. It's harder than it sounds, he said. I know, Cole said. He's attacking the only thing I've ever had that was actually mine, Ryan said. My reputation as a mechanic. The thing I built by myself with no help from anybody. I know, Cole said again. That's the part that's hard to be rational about. I know, Cole said, for the third time, and this time the repetition wasn't hollow. It was the sound of someone who understood the specific thing being said and was choosing to acknowledge it rather than solve it. Ryan exhaled. He said, good, Cole said. The situation with Hale moved through the following weeks the way legal things move slowly, with the kind of procedural momentum that was invisible from the outside, but building underneath. Sandra Reeves had filed the initial complaints with the labor board. 2 additional former employees had come forward after hearing through the community that others were already on record. The investigation had been opened. Victor Hale apparently hired an attorney and was contesting everything vigorously. Sandra Reeves had told Ryan was exactly what a person does when they have something real to contest. Ryan had exactly one piece of evidence that Victor could not contest, the paramedic report from June 14th, which documented the time of arrival, the condition of the patient, the duration of the bystander, CPR, and the outcome. It was a fact on paper that could not be reworded or reframed. Man had collapsed. A young employee had performed CPR for 11 minutes and 43 seconds. The patient had survived. The employee had been terminated the same day. Facts don't need defenders. Ryan had said that to Terrence weeks ago, and he found himself returning to it, using it as ballast on the days when Hale's narrative was louder than usual, and the unfairness of it had an actual physical quality, a pressure. Do your work. Let the process do what the process does. Did his work. And his work in those weeks was extraordinary. Reynolds said it plainly at the end of October, sitting on the edge of the workbench at the end of a long Friday with 2 coffees between them and the particular satisfaction of a week of difficult jobs done well. You know, you're the best technician I've had in this shop since Terrence's first 2 years, Reynolds said. Terrence was exceptional his first 2 years. Ryan looked at him. Terrence was exceptional. Still is, Reynolds said, but you're different. You diagnose the way old-school mechanics diagnosed, before the computers did all the thinking. You listen to the bike. You feel what it's telling you. He paused. That's not something you can teach someone. You either have it or you don't. Ryan was quiet for a moment. Victor used to tell me I was a mid-level tech at best, he said. The reason he kept me around was that I was cheap and reliable, not because I had exceptional skill. Reynolds looked at him with an expression that was not quite anger, but was adjacent to it. Victor Hale couldn't diagnose a broken turn signal on his best day, he said flatly. Ryan almost laughed. A real laugh, this time not a near thing. Actual laughter, the kind that comes up from somewhere lower than the throat and doesn't ask permission. Reynolds looked at him with the expression of someone who has just seen something they weren't expecting and are quietly glad about it. There it is, Reynolds said mildly. What? I was starting to wonder if you knew how to do that, Reynolds said. Ryan shook his head and drank his coffee, let the laughter settle into the comfortable silence of 2 people who had found a working rhythm together and were content in it. That night, alone in the room above the shop, with the lock that was his and the particular quiet of a life that was beginning to have real shape, Ryan sat on the edge of the bed and did something he hadn't done in years. Took out a piece of paper, and he started to write down goals. Not survival math, not the calculations of minimum needed, least risk, safest option. Actual goals. Things he wanted that weren't just continuations of staying alive. Motorcycle of his own, an ASE Master Technician certification, eventually not soon, but eventually his own shop. Small, one bay, the kind of place where the work was done right, and the people who brought their bikes in were treated like their machines mattered because they did. He wrote for almost an hour. The list was longer than he expected. He hadn't realized how many things he'd wanted and set aside because wanting required hope, and hope was a luxury he hadn't been able to afford. He could afford it now. Not because he had money, his finances were still modest and straightforward, and he was careful with every dollar. But because the architecture of his life had changed, because there were people in it now who knew his name and had chosen to know it, because he had a place to wake up and work to go to, and the quiet, radical stability of a person who no longer had to calculate everything from the assumption of loss. Folded the paper and put it in the drawer of the bedside table. He lay back and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Cole. Cole had come by Thursday, which was becoming a semi-regular Thursday thing that neither of them had formalized or discussed. Cole would appear around noon, look at whatever was in the bay, ask Ryan technical questions that Ryan suspected were mostly pretextual and occasionally were genuine, and they'd eat lunch from the taco place 2 blocks over at the folding table. Reynolds kept in the back. During Thursday's lunch, Cole had said something that Ryan was still turning over, and eating in companionable silence when Cole said, without looking up from his food, "You ever think about what comes after?" "After what?" Ryan said. "After the building part. After you've got your footing. After the life looks the way it's supposed to look." He paused. "What you do with it then?" Ryan thought about it genuinely. "Think about it more than I used to," he said. "I didn't used to let myself think that far forward. Now I think." Ryan stopped. "Reorganized. Think the reason I couldn't look away from you on that floor is the same reason I couldn't look away from any of the other kids I grew up in the system with. The ones who fell through. The ones who aged out and didn't have what I had, which wasn't much, but was a mechanical ability that at least got me employed." He set his food down. "There were kids I knew who didn't have that, who came out of the system with nothing and no way in and no one paying attention. I think about them." Cole looked at him steadily. "I want to do something about that," Ryan said. "I don't know what yet. Don't have the resources yet. But I want to. I want there to be something. For kids like that, some kind of bridge, some kind of way in." Cole was quiet for a long moment. "Tell me more about what that looks like," Cole said. And he asked it the way he asked everything, with the complete unperforming attention of a man who was actually listening. Ryan told him. He talked for almost 20 minutes. It wasn't polished. It wasn't organized. It was the raw version of an idea that had been living in the back of his mind since he was 18 and had never had space or safety enough to be said out loud. Program, an apprenticeship model, something that partnered with the shops that were willing, that gave young people out of foster care or homelessness a genuine technical education and a fair wage while they were learning. Not charity, not a handout, an on-ramp. Cole listened to all of it. When Ryan finished, Cole said, "You've been thinking about this for a while." "A long time," Ryan said. "I just never thought I'd be in a position where it was something other than a wish." "You're not in that position yet," Cole said, "but you're building toward it." He paused. Building towards something is the important part. The position arrives when the building is done. Ryan nodded. "I want you to write it down," Cole said. "Everything you just told me, in whatever form it comes out. Not for me, for you. So you have it." Ryan thought about the piece of paper in his bedside table drawer and almost said something about it and then didn't because some things were still private and entitled to stay that way. "I'll do that," he said. And now, lying on his back in the room above the shop, he stared at the ceiling and felt the specific texture of a life that was becoming something. Not arrived, not yet. Still becoming. Still under construction. But the direction was clear, and the foundation was real, and the work was honest, and the people around him were the kind of people who showed up and stayed. Closed his eyes. He thought about Cole's question, what you do with it after the building part. He thought about the kids who'd aged out after him, the ones whose names he knew. Marcus, who'd been in the same group home for 3 years before Ryan moved, who had a gift for woodworking that nobody at the facility had ever thought to develop. Jess, who could have gone to college if anyone had helped her figure out the application process, who instead spent her first year out trying to navigate a system that assumed she had a support network she'd never had. Dario, who was probably the most naturally mechanically talented person Ryan had ever met beside himself, who was currently last Ryan had heard, which was 14 months ago living in his car in Scottsdale. Dario. Ryan opened his eyes. He sat up. He pulled out his phone and did something he'd been putting off for reasons he couldn't quite defend. He searched for Dario's number in his contacts, found it under the simple entry D and stared at it. 14 months, he pressed call. It rang 4 times. 5. He was preparing himself for voicemail when the line connected. Hello? The voice was cautious. The voice of someone who screened calls because most calls were not good news. Dario, Ryan said. It's Ryan Carter. A pause long enough to tell its own story. Ryan. The caution in the voice shifted, not gone, but mixed with something else. Surprise. And underneath the surprise, something careful and fragile that Ryan recognized immediately because he'd carried it himself for years. Hope. Where are you living right now? Ryan said. A longer pause. Why? Dario said. Because I want to know, Ryan said. Because I might have something worth talking about. The silence on the line had the quality of a person trying to decide how much to trust. Ryan knew that silence from the inside. He waited it out without pushing. Scottsdale, Dario said finally. I'm in Scottsdale. Are you working? On and off. Cash stuff, nothing regular. Do you still know engines? Ryan said. A different quality of silence this time. Are you serious? Dario said. I'm very serious, Ryan said. He heard Dario exhale a long, complicated exhale that had several months' worth of things compressed into it. Yeah, Dario said. Yeah, I still know engines. Good, Ryan said. Then I want you to come to Phoenix. He talked to Dario for 40 minutes, told him about Reynolds, about the shop, about the conversation with Cole, about the idea that was still an idea, but was becoming more solid by the day. Told Dario what he could offer right now, which was limited a conversation with Reynolds about a potential position, his own personal vouching, the possibility of something real if Dario was willing to show up for it. He did not promise more than he had. That was important. He'd lived under promised more than someone had and understood viscerally how much damage it did. But what he had was real. And Dario, on the other end of the line in Scottsdale, heard the realness of it. Ryan could tell by the shift in his voice, from the careful flatness of someone managing their expectations to the cautious, restrained, terrified to want it quality of someone who was beginning, against their own defenses, to want it. You're not yanking my chain, Dario said. Not quite a question. No, Ryan said. Reynolds actually has a position. I haven't asked him yet, Ryan said. But I know Reynolds. And I know you. And I'm going to ask him tomorrow and tell him exactly what I'm telling you. If he says yes, which I believe he will, then it's real. If he says no, I'll tell you that, and we figure out something else. He paused. Dario, I need to know you to actually come. That if I bring this to Reynolds and it's real, you'll get on a bus. Another long pause. Yeah, Dario said, and his voice had something raw in it that neither of them was going to comment on. Yeah, I'd come. Ryan talked to Reynolds the next morning before the shop opened. He told him about Dario, the mechanical talent, the background, the situation. Did not soften or embellish either side of the picture. Told Reynolds exactly who Dario was and exactly what he was dealing with and exactly why Ryan believed he was worth a chance. Reynolds listened the way. Reynolds always listened completely, without reaction, until he had all the information. When Ryan finished, Reynolds was quiet for a moment. This is something you're going to keep doing, isn't it? Reynolds said. Wasn't quite a question. Probably, Ryan said. Reynolds looked at him. You know I only have so many bays. I know. Reynolds was quiet for another moment. He's as good with engines as you say? He's as good as I was when I started at Desert Road, Ryan said. Maybe better in some ways. His instincts are stronger than mine were at 17. What he's never had is someone willing to develop them. Reynolds drummed his fingers on the desk once, twice. Bring him in, he said. I'll give him a week's trial. Work speaks, same as it did with you. He produces in that week. We talk about something permanent. Ryan nodded. Reynolds said, yeah. Reynolds looked at him steadily. What you're doing, bringing people in, vouching for them, building something out of your own experience that's bigger than a job placement. You know that. I'm starting to, Ryan said. Good, Reynolds said. 'Cause Cole talked to me last week about something. About you and an idea you shared with him. He wanted to know if I'd be willing to be part of it if it became something more formal. He paused. Told him yes. I want you to know that I told him yes before you ever brought Dario in here this morning. Ryan stood at the threshold of the office. Reynolds had said yes before Ryan had asked. Before he demonstrated it was real. Before he'd built the case. Reynolds had looked at who Ryan was becoming and decided in advance to be part of it. Ryan stood with that for a moment, the specific weight of it, the specific warmth of it, and did not try to make it smaller than it was. Thank you, he said. Reynolds waved a hand. Stop thanking people and go call your friend, he said. Tell him when the bus leaves. Ryan went upstairs. He called Dario. He said, the bus leaves whenever you're ready. Dario said, I'll be there Saturday. And Ryan stood in the room above the shop with his phone in his hand and looked at the piece of paper in the open drawer of the bedside table, the piece of paper with the goals on it, the list that had been longer than he expected because there was more in him that wanted than he'd allowed himself to know. And he thought about the first item on the list, not the motorcycle, not the certification, not the shop. The first item on the list, the one he'd written before any of the others, in the handwriting of someone who was figuring out what they were allowed to want, find the ones who fell through, pull them back. Dario was going to be in Phoenix on Saturday. Ryan Carter was 20 years old and had nothing, and had everything and understood, standing in his room with his hand on a phone that had just changed one person's trajectory, that those two things were not contradictions. They were the whole point. Dario arrived on a Saturday, like he said he would. Came off the bus with a duffel bag and the specific posture of someone who has learned to make themselves small in unfamiliar spaces, shoulders slightly in, eyes reading the room before the room had a chance to read him. Ryan recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a dialect you grew up speaking. Stood at 100 bus stations and 100 doorways and 100 new placements with that exact posture, not afraid. Exactly. Just prepared. Calibrated for the possibility that whatever was waiting might not be what was promised. Ryan was standing outside the shop when the bus pulled in. He hadn't told Dario he'd be there. He just was. Dario saw him and stopped walking. They looked at each other. Across the sidewalk, two people who had grown up in the same difficult geography, who had aged out of the same system within a year of each other, who had gone different directions and arrived at very different places, and were now standing 15 feet apart in Phoenix on a Saturday morning with the specific complicated emotion of people who have survived things together without being in the same room. You're actually here, Dario said. I said I'd be here, Ryan said. Dario's jaw moved. Yeah, but people say things, I know, Ryan said. Come on. Reynolds opens at 8. They walked to Mesa Ironworks with the duffel bag between them and didn't say much, which was comfortable rather than awkward because it had always been that way between them, the ease of two people whose friendship had been built on shared work and parallel understanding rather than conversation. Reynolds met Dario with a handshake and 2 sentences. Ryan says, you know engines. Show me. Then he pointed at a Road King in the second bay that had a fuel delivery problem nobody had been able to pin down, and he walked back to his office. Ryan watched from the edge of the bay. Dario set his duffel bag against the wall. He stood in front of the motorcycle for almost a full minute without touching it, just looking, reading it, doing exactly what Ryan had described to Reynolds when he'd said Dario's instincts were strong. Then he reached for a tool, and his hands found the right one without looking, and he started working. Ryan felt something in his chest that was partly pride and partly relief and partly the particular warmth of a person watching a friend find solid ground under their feet. Terrence appeared beside him after a few minutes. Reynolds told me about the trial week, Terrence said quietly, watching Dario work. Yeah, Ryan said. He going to make it? Ryan watched Dario's hands, the economy of movement, the purposeful efficiency, the complete focus of someone who had found the one thing in the world that made sense to them and was doing it. He's going to make it, Ryan said. Dario found the fault in 40 minutes. It was a cracked fuel injector O-ring causing an intermittent pressure drop subtle enough that it only showed up in specific conditions, which was why it had been elusive. He came to get Reynolds, explained it without preamble, showed him the evidence. Reynolds looked at the O-ring, looked at Dario, said nothing for a long moment. Then, parts are in the third cabinet. Fix it. That was the trial week, compressed into one morning. Reynolds never formally said the word hired. He simply started including Dario in the schedule the following Monday, which in Reynolds' language was the loudest possible statement of approval. Ryan and Dario ate dinner that first Saturday at a diner 2 blocks from the shop. Real food, the kind you sit down for, the kind that implies you have time and a place to be afterward. Dario ate like someone who hadn't been sure where the next meal was coming from, which Ryan understood without comment because he'd eaten that way himself not long ago. "This is real," Dario said midway through the meal. Not a question. More like a thing he was confirming for his own benefit by saying it aloud. "It's real," Ryan said. "Reynolds isn't going to." Dario stop. "Going to what?" "Change," Dario said. "Shift. Decide we're more trouble than we're worth." Ryan thought about how to answer this honestly rather than reassuringly. "Reynolds is the most consistent person I've met," he said. "What you see is what he is. There's no version of Reynolds that's hiding something underneath." He paused. "Even if something changed, even if it did, you have your skill. That goes with you. That's yours. Nobody can administer your hands." Dario looked at him across the table. "You sound like someone who figured something out." "Figured some things out," Ryan said. "Some of them the hard way." "Tell me," Dario said. So Ryan told him. Not the broad version. Dario already knew the broad version. The story had traveled even to Scottsdale, had reached Dario as a fragmented account through mutual contacts before Ryan's phone call ever came. He told him the inside version, what it had actually felt like to be on that floor for 12 minutes, what it had felt like to be fired immediately after. The shelter on Van Buren and the bus to the hospital, and Cole Dawson sitting up in his hospital bed, asking who saved me. The room above the shop, and the first morning waking up with a locked door that was his. The gathering on the Saturday, with the motorcycles filling the street. Dario listened without interrupting, the way he'd always listened, completely, tracking everything. When Ryan finished, Dario was quiet for a moment. "You saved his life and lost your job," Dario said. "Your first instinct was to protect the decision." "I didn't think of it that way." "You said, I know what it feels like to be the person people walk past," Dario said. "That's not a justification. That's a code. You have a code and you've had it your whole life. And Victor Hale spent 2 years trying to make you forget it and you didn't." He paused. "That's the part of the story nobody's saying." Ryan looked at him. "Saying it," Dario said. It was the most Dario had said in one stretch for as long as Ryan could remember. And it landed with the precision of someone who had been listening carefully enough to find the thing that needed naming. Ryan looked at his coffee cup. "Thank you," he said. "Don't get sentimental," Dario said. "It's embarrassing." Ryan laughed, a real one. The kind that came easier now than it used to. The labor board investigation moved into November. Sandra Reeves called Ryan on a Tuesday morning to tell him that 2 additional employees had come forward, people who'd worked at Desert Road Garage before Ryan, people whose situations fit the same pattern so precisely that the word pattern had become practice in the official language of the complaint. 6 people total. A range of wage violations, improper deductions, housing arrangements used as employment leverage. The kind of case, Sandra said, that got taken seriously because it had stopped looking like isolated incidents. "How does Hale look right now?" Ryan asked. "Exposed," Sandra said. "He's still contesting. His attorney is still making arguments, but the documentation we've assembled, or rather, the documentation that his own payroll records inadvertently contain, is not friendly to his position." She paused. "Ryan, I want to say something." "Okay. The fact that you came forward first, that's what opened the door. The other 5 people were out there. They had their own experiences, their own grievances, but they hadn't moved. They needed to see that someone else had moved first, that it was survivable to say what happened." Another pause. "Didn't just save Cole Dawson's life. You made it possible for 5 other people to say what was done to them." Ryan held his phone and said nothing for a moment. "Appreciate you telling me that," he said. "I thought you should know," Sandra said. "Since you made a point of telling me at the outset that you weren't doing this for revenge." A small shift in her tone that wasn't quite a smile, but was its vicinity. "Sometimes the right reasons produce consequences that feel a lot like justice anyway." After he hung up, Ryan sat in the room above the shop for a long time. Thought about the 17-year-old version of himself walking into Desert Road Garage with a half-second hesitation. Thought about the 2 years of calculated exploitation dressed up as opportunity. Thought about Deacon, the man who'd been there before him, who'd told Victor too much and paid for it, who was probably still there or somewhere like it, still in the leash and barely enough arrangement that was Victor's preferred tool. He thought about all the people who had walked past, thought about what Dario had said at the diner. You have a code and you've had it your whole life. He hadn't thought of it as a code. He'd thought of it as survival, as a set of rules that kept him moving when the environment was designed to keep him still. Dario had looked at the same set of facts and seen something Ryan had missed about his own story, that the rules he lived by weren't just survival mechanics. They were values. And values weren't things you developed. They were things you discovered, things that were already there, already embedded in who you were, that the right circumstances revealed. The concrete floor on June 14th had been that circumstance. Cole had named it in the hospital. You were certain. Remember what it felt like to be certain. Ryan remembered. He remembered it the way the body remembers things it needs, not as a thought, but as a feeling in his hands, in his chest, in the particular quality of focus that had come over him, the moment he understood what was happening and what was required. He picked up the piece of paper from the drawer, the one with the goals. He looked at the list. Then he picked up a pen and added something at the bottom. He wrote it in 3 words, make it formal. Cole came by on Thursday, as had become the way of Thursdays. He looked different than he had in the hospital, not just healthier, though he was healthier. The cardiac rehabilitation program hadn't done what it was designed to do, restoring a version of physical function that Cole seemed to regard as the minimum acceptable threshold. He looked lighter in a way that had nothing to do with weight. The particular compression that Ryan had noticed in him during the early weeks, the tightly managed quality of a man carrying something he wasn't saying, had eased. They ate at the folding table in the back. Dario joined them for the first time, which produced the particular dynamic of 3 people who are all more comfortable with silence than most people are, but who are also finding tentatively that they like each other's company. Reynolds appeared in the doorway at one point, looked at the 3 of them around the folding table, said Taco Tuesday became Taco Thursday apparently, and disappeared back into his office. Dario almost smiled. It was a near thing, like Ryan's near smiles had been in the beginning. Tell him about the program, Dario said to Ryan. Without looking up from his food, Cole looked at Ryan. I was going to, Ryan said to Dario. You've been going to for 3 weeks, Dario said. Ryan looked at Cole. I've been putting together an outline, he said, for the thing I talked to you about. The apprenticeship model. Tell me what you have, Cole said, so Ryan told him. This time it was more organized than it had been. At the hospital, not polished, but structured. He'd been working on it in the evenings, in the hour before sleep, when his mind was at its clearest. Formal apprenticeship program targeting young people aging out of the foster care system, partnering with shops that were willing. Reynolds had already said yes, and Ryan had 2 other shop owners in mind who he thought might be open to it. Paid apprenticeship model where participants earned while they learned, not as charity, but as employees with real responsibilities and real standards. A support structure around the work component, help navigating housing, basic financial literacy, the practical life skills the system consistently failed to provide before releasing people into the world with a bus pass and a pamphlet. Cole listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ryan finished, Cole said, how are you funding it? That's the part I don't have yet, Ryan said. Cole nodded. What would you need to start, not at full scale, just to run a genuine pilot? 3 to 5 participants, 2 shops, 6 months. Ryan had done the math. He told Cole the number. Cole repeated it back without blinking. That's not as large as I expected, he said. I kept it lean on purpose, Ryan said. I don't want to build something that requires more than it can sustain. Cole looked at him for a moment with the expression Ryan had come to recognize as Cole processing something he'd already partly decided. I want to put something in, Cole said, as a founding contribution. Not from me personally, from a small fund. The chapter maintains for community investments. We've done it before, always for things that made tangible differences. I want to put it to the group. He paused. I think I know what the answer is going to be. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, not resistance, just the reflex of a person who had spent years managing the distance between himself and things that felt too good to trust. Cole, he said. I know, Cole said, not charity. Community investment in something with a real model and a real return. The return in this case is measured in young people who don't fall through the floor. He held Ryan's gaze. Let me put it to the group. You build the formal proposal. Reynolds can review it. Sandra Reeves can look at the structure. And then we see what's possible. The word possible had a different weight than it used to. Ryan had noticed this happening gradually, certain words changing in texture, carrying more rather than less. Possible used to mean unlikely but not impossible. Now it meant something active, something that required work to realize, but that work could actually reach. Okay, Ryan said. Dario, who had been eating quietly through this entire conversation, said without looking up, he's been carrying that outline around in his head for 6 years. Just so you know. Cole looked at Ryan. Ryan looked at Dario. 6 years, Cole said. Since he was 14, Dario said. He had this whole thing mapped out in the group home. To talk about it when the staff weren't around. How you'd set it up, what you'd teach, what the kids would need that wasn't being given to them. He finally looked up. Just didn't think anyone would listen. The silence in the back of the shop had the quality of something significant being received. Cole looked at Ryan with an expression that moved through several things in a short time, something that started near surprise and arrived somewhere near understanding. And underneath both, something that was simpler and older and harder to name. You were carrying this at 14, Cole said. I didn't have anything else to carry, Ryan said. Voice was steady. I had no money, no family, no permanent address. But I could see what was wrong with the system I was in. Could see what it needed that it didn't have. And I could think about it. Thinking was free. Cole set his food down. Ryan, he said. The way he said the name, the way he'd said it before in the hospital, the way that meant he was paying complete attention. I want you to understand something. The program you're describing is important. It's going to help people, real people, whose lives are going to be different because of it. He paused. But I need you to understand that it exists because of who you are, not just what you did on June 14th. The 12 minutes on the floor opened the door. But what was behind the door was already there. Been there since you were 14 years old, thinking about it in a group home. Another pause. Don't shortchange that. Don't let the story of one dramatic moment eclipse the truth of 20 years of being the kind of person who thinks about other people even when he has nothing. Ryan said nothing for a long time. Dario had gone back to eating with the tact of someone who understood that the thing happening beside him was private enough to deserve the courtesy of not being watched. I'm working on it, Ryan said finally, letting the story be bigger than the floor. Faster, Cole said, and was something in it that was almost warmth, almost humor, the particular register Cole achieved when he wanted to lighten something without diminishing it. The formal proposal took 3 weeks to write. Ryan did it in the evenings, at the small desk in the room above the shop, with the same focused patience he applied to engine diagnostics, methodically, carefully, returning to sections that weren't right and reworking them until they were. Reynolds reviewed the financial structure and marked up 2 sections where the assumptions were optimistic and needed to be tightened. Sandra Reeves looked at the legal framework for the employment component and made recommendations. Terrence read the full thing on a Saturday afternoon and said, "This is serious. You know this is serious?" And Ryan said that was the intention. And Terrence said, "I want to be involved. When you're ready, put me on the list." Ryan put him on the list. He sent the final version to Cole on a Wednesday night. Cole called him Thursday morning, before Ryan had even gotten downstairs to open the shop. "I read it last night," Cole said. "Okay," Ryan said. "I sent it to Danny last night after I read it." "Okay," Ryan said, more carefully. "Danny called me this morning," Cole said. Ryan waited. "He wants to meet with you," Cole said. "Not just a conversation. Formal sit-down with 3 or 4 chapter members who have experience with community programs. He wants to hear you present it." A pause, Ryan. "He called me at 7 in the morning. Danny Walker has not called me at 7 in the morning in the 11 years I've known him." Ryan sat on the edge of his bed in the room above the shop. 7 in the morning when? Ryan, Saturday, Cole said. The meeting was at Danny's house, and there were 5 people in the room besides Ryan, Danny, Cole, 2 chapter members Ryan had met briefly at the Saturday gathering named Lou and Grace. Grace turned out to be one of the longest-serving and most respected members of the chapter. and who had the particular quality of someone whose silence was more informative than most people's words, and a fifth person Ryan hadn't expected. Her name was Dr. Angela Marsh. She ran a nonprofit out of Tucson that worked with transition-age youth, had been doing it for 15 years, and had been called by Danny Walker the same morning he'd called Cole, because Danny Walker, turned out, was not a man who did anything at half measure. Ryan sat at the table with his proposal printed in front of him and looked at 5 people whose collective experience in the relevant areas was staggering, and felt for just a moment the particular exposure of someone who has built something with their own hands and is now showing it to people who know exactly what they're looking at. Then he thought about 12 minutes on a concrete floor. He opened his mouth and started talking. He talked for 25 minutes. He laid out the model methodically, the rationale, the structure, the financial projections, the partnership framework with shops, the support services component, the measurement criteria for success. Talked about it the way he talked about engine problems, from the diagnosis outward, starting with what was wrong, moving to what was needed, arriving at how to provide it. Nobody interrupted him. When he finished, Grace, who had said nothing the entire time, said, "What's your exit strategy for participants who don't have the mechanical aptitude?" Ryan had anticipated this. The model screens for mechanical interest before technical aptitude, he said. What we're not doing is putting people in a garage because it's available. We're finding people who have the same thing. I had the instinct, the interest, and developing what's already there. The ones who don't have it aren't served by the program. They're served by other programs. He paused. Dr. Marsh's organization does case management and pathways work. I've looked at the model. What we do and what they do aren't competitors. They're sequential. Grace looked at Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh looked at Ryan. You looked at our model, she said. I looked at your annual reports and your program description on your website, Ryan said. The gap in your services is specifically the vocational training component for young men with mechanical aptitude. You've noted it in your reports. You're not set up to provide it. We would be. Dr. Marsh had the expression of someone being shown the inside of their own house by a person who's never been inside before and finding it accurate. You're 20 years old, she said. Yes, Ryan said. You wrote this in 3 weeks. I've been thinking about it for 6 years, Ryan said. The writing was the easy part. Dr. Marsh looked at Danny. Danny looked at Cole. Cole looked at Ryan with the expression of a man watching something he set in motion arrive exactly where he thought it would. I want to have a longer conversation with you, Doctor, Marsh said, about a formal partnership, not theoretical. Actual. I'd like that, Ryan said. Lou, who had been taking notes throughout the meeting, said the chapter fund can cover the pilot year. Full amount. We voted. He said it with the brevity of a man who doesn't waste words on things that are already decided. Danny told us what was in the proposal. We voted before this meeting. Ryan looked at Danny. I wanted you to present it anyway, Danny said, because you deserved the room. You deserved to stand in front of people and make the case for something you built and have them hear it. Not just receive a yes from a phone call. He paused. The yes was already there, Ryan. We just wanted you to have the experience of earning it out loud. Ryan sat very still. He sat with it, the fullness of what was happening, the weight of what was being offered and what it meant and where it came from, and how far it was from a 10 by 12 room behind a motel with $240 under the mattress. Sat with the specific vertigo of a person whose life has changed so thoroughly that the old coordinates no longer map onto anything recognizable. Underneath the vertigo, something else. It had something that had been growing quietly since June 14th, since 12 minutes on a concrete floor, since the moment he pressed his hands to Cole Dawson's chest and refused to stop something that didn't have a name in English or maybe in any language, but that felt in the body like the particular piece of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do and is standing inside it for the first time. Thank you, Ryan said, to all of them, to the room. Danny nodded. Cole said nothing, but his expression said it. The program launched its pilot in January. Ryan named it Iron Floor, not because he had explained the name to anyone, but because he knew what it meant, and the people who needed to understand it would understand it, and the people who didn't would learn. The name of the concrete, the name of the place where you either keep going or you stop, the name of what was underneath you when you decided who you were going to be. 3 participants in the first cohort. Dario was already employed. He'd more than survived his trial week, become in 4 months one of Reynolds' most reliable technicians, and had the particular focused intensity of someone who has found their footing after a very long time of uncertain ground. But he came to the program's orientation as a mentor, standing in the back of the room with his arms crossed and his expression carefully neutral, which Ryan recognized as Dario's version of deeply invested. The 3 participants were 17, 19, and 22, all out of or aging out of the foster system, all with some mechanical interest identified through referrals from Dr. Marsh's organization, all with the specific posture that Ryan recognized, shoulders slightly in, eyes reading the room. The posture of people who have learned to be prepared for the promise that doesn't hold. Ryan stood in front of them on the first day. He was 20 years old. He had a backpack's worth of possessions 6 months ago and a sock with $240 in it. He had been fired for saving a man's life. He had slept in a shelter on Van Buren and eaten gas station crackers and built a system of survival out of nothing, and a mechanical gift that one man had used to control him for 2 years. He was 20 years old, and he stood in front of 3 young people who needed to understand one thing above all others before any tool was picked up or any engine was looked at. "My name is Ryan Carter," he said. "6 months ago, I had nothing. Bag and a number and a sock. I got here because of 12 minutes on a concrete floor where I made a decision I had no guarantee would work out." He paused. The decision wasn't about mechanics. It was about who I was going to be. That's the only decision that matters. Everything else, the skill, the work, the wage, the room, the opportunity, all of it follows from that one decision. He looked at them steadily. "This program is going to teach you how to work on engines. But that's not what it's actually about. It's about showing you that you can build something, that your hands and your attention and your refusal to stop matter. Nobody can administer that out of you." He paused. Victor Hale tried. He failed. The 19-year-old in the front row, a young woman named Kezia, who had the sharp, watchful eyes of someone who had been underestimated by institutions her entire life, said, "Who's Victor Hale?" "Someone who doesn't matter anymore," Ryan said, "which is the best outcome for a person like that." Kezia almost smiled. Ryan looked at all 3 of them. "You're not charity cases," he said. "You're not projects. You're mechanics who haven't had a real shop to work in yet. Changes today." He paused. "Any questions before we start?" The 22-year-old, a young man named Tobias, who hadn't said a word since he walked in, raised his hand. "Yeah," Ryan said. "The guy you saved," Tobias said. "The biker. Does he know about this, about the program?" Ryan nodded. "He helped fund it." Tobias processed this for a moment. "So you saved his life, and he helped you build this." He gestured at the room, the bay visible through the window, at everything surrounding them. "It's one way to tell it," Ryan said. "What's the other way?" Tobias said. Ryan thought about it. Thought about everything Cole had said in the hospital, at the Thursday lunches, at Danny's house, and everything Reynolds had said, and everything Danny had said, and everything Dario had said at the diner about the code. He thought about the piece of paper in the drawer, thought about 12 minutes on a concrete floor and the particular quality of certainty that had come over him in those minutes. Not confidence, not bravery, but the specific clarity of a person who has found, single overwhelming moment, exactly where their values live. "Other way to tell it," Ryan said, "is that what happened in that garage was always going to happen. Because of who I was. Because of what I believed without knowing I believed it. Cole Dawson's heart-stopping was the moment, but the decision was made long before that. It was made every time I kept going when stopping would have been easier. Every time I stayed on the floor of something instead of walking away from it." He paused. "The people you're going to become, they're already in you. This program doesn't put them there. It just gives them room." The room was quiet. Outside, the sound of the shop warming up tools, engines, the particular morning sounds of a place where work was about to be done. Kezia's hand went up again. "When do we start?" she said. Ryan looked at her, at Tobias, at the 17-year-old named Marcus, who had said nothing but whose eyes had been absorbing everything with a precision that Ryan recognized because he'd had those eyes himself. "Right now," Ryan said. Cole came by that afternoon, as he sometimes did, unannounced, unhurried. parking the parking outside with the quiet authority of a man who had been riding long enough to arrive without making an event of arriving. Reynolds let him in without ceremony. He walked through the shop to the training bay, stood in the doorway, and watched. Kizia was under a motorcycle for the first time in her life, with Dario crouched beside her, walking her through a brake inspection with the patient, precise teaching style of someone who had been taught patiently and precisely and understood the value of it. Tobias was at the workbench with Terence, learning how to read a service manual without treating it as an obstacle. Marcus was standing next to Ryan, who was explaining a fuel system diagnosis with the quiet clarity of someone for whom explanation came as naturally as the work itself. Cole stood in the doorway for a few minutes. Nobody asked him to announce himself or explain his presence. He was simply there, the way certain presences are simply there, not demanding attention, not requiring acknowledgement, just adding their specific weight to the gravity of the room. For a while, he stepped back. He found Reynolds in the office, sitting behind the desk with a coffee cup and a stack of invoices. "How's he doing?" Reynolds said without looking up. Cole thought about it for a moment, really thought about it the way he thought about things that mattered, with the full weight of his attention and the full length of his experience. "He's doing what he was always going to do," Cole said. "Just got out of the way." Reynolds looked up. "You didn't get out of the way," Reynolds said. "You got in front of it. There's a difference." Cole looked at the window that faced the training bay. He could see Ryan through it, 20 years old, no family, no inheritance, no safety net, except the one he'd built himself out of decisions made in the worst moments of his life, explaining something to Marcus with his hands, patient and focused, giving the same quality of attention to this 17-year-old that he gave to every engine he'd ever worked on. Complete, unmanaged, real. "Maybe," Cole said. He drove home in the January afternoon with the particular ease of a man who has put something into motion that is now moving on its own, which is the only outcome worth working toward. The road was cold, the engine was warm. The miles went past in the reliable, honest way that miles went past when the bike was right and the rider was present, and the road asked nothing except to be traveled. Thought about June 14th. He thought about a 20-year-old mechanic who had dropped to a concrete floor and refused to stand back up until the job was done. He thought about what he'd said to Ryan in the hospital. "You thought you were nobody because someone needed you to believe that." The neon sign outside had. And he thought about what he knew now. On the other side of it, what 7 months of watching Carter build something from the wreckage of the worst afternoon of his life had shown him. The people the world tries hardest to convince they are nothing are, very often, the ones who change everything. Not because of what happens to them, because of what they refuse to become when it does. Ryan Carter had been given every reason to become someone who looked away. He never did. And on a January afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, in a training bay above a shop on a street nobody had heard of, 3 young people who had been failed by every system designed to catch them were learning to use their hands, learning to trust the work, learning for the first time that what they could build with skill and patience and the refusal to stop mattered. Because a 20-year-old with nothing had decided on a concrete floor that the person in front of him was worth 12 minutes. 12 minutes had become a program, and a program was becoming a future. Ryan Carter, who had spent 20 years being the person nobody saw, was now the person nobody who met him would ever forget, not because of what he had, because of who he was. Who he was had been there all along waiting, on the floor, the 12 minutes, the code that Dario had named, and Cole had recognized, and Reynolds had trusted, and Danny had honored, and 3 young people in a training bay were now, without knowing it, beginning to inherit. That was the whole story. And it started the way every real story starts, not with a dramatic moment or a lucky break or the intervention of anyone more powerful. Started with one person on a cold concrete floor who looked at someone the world had written off as already lost and decided, not today, not on my watch, not while I still have hands.